Okay, well, it's noon right now, so let's go ahead and get started. I'm sure we'll have some folks, I told Elizabeth and Dennis this, that jumping on the next 5 to 10 minutes, just going between things. But thank you everyone so much for joining us today for a Rough Cut, I guess the Institute on Ecosystems Rough Cut Seminar Series. Really excited to see a wonderful turnout again. This whole virtual seminar has been new for us. But just a few kind of housekeeping things before I introduce Dennis and Elizabeth. You'll notice that as you entered, you are automatically muted, so just make sure that you keep your mics on mute to help mitigate any. Oh, we have somebody that says they can't get any audio. Are other folks receiving audio as well? Double check that. Okay, so that might be an issue. Let's see, Edward Dratz. But we can figure that out as we go along. But sometimes WebEx is kind of weird, but we can keep moving through and hopefully it'll be able to connect. But make sure that you keep muted just again to help mitigate any noise. And then I can see everyone pretty much has their videos turned off, but just ask that you keep your videos off during the presentation just to help with the bandwidth capacity and making sure we don't max it out and accidentally cause WebEx to turn off, which would not be good. But the only other thing is as the presentation, as Dennis and Elizabeth are speaking, I will ask that if you have any questions to please answer them into the chat function on WebEx. This is again just to make things run a little bit more efficiently. And as questions come up, I've talked with Dennis and Elizabeth can help moderate those throughout the presentation. And then, of course, at the end of the presentation, if additional questions come up, I will make sure that Dennis and Elizabeth see those and are able to answer those as well. So thank you all again. So I will go ahead and introduce our speakers for today. We're very excited. They're able to reschedule for a presentation in the spring, but we have Dennis Jorgensen with us here, who is the Bison Program Manager for the World Wildlife Fund in the Northern Great Plains. And he has worked for them since 2007 and received his master's in 2009 from the University of Calgary, studying the migrations of prairie rattlesnakes in Alberta, which is amazing. And then we have Dr. Elizabeth Bird with us as well, who is a project development and grant specialist with the College of Education, Health, and Human Development here at Montana State University. And Elizabeth received her Ph.D. From the University of California, Santa Cruz in History of Consciousness, which is also just really amazing sounding. So I'll go ahead and leave it at that. I'm going to turn my video off, and Dennis and Elizabeth, I will let y'all get started and go ahead and see screen share your presentation and make sure that that's working.
Excellent.
Madison, maybe you could email Ed Dratz the phone number to call in at.
That sounds perfect. Ed, I can get that to you.
Okay, excellent. Well, thank you so much, Madison, for the introduction. And I hope you all can hear me well enough and that Edward will be able to shortly. I thought just to begin with, if Elizabeth would like to say a little bit more about how she came to work with the people of Fort Peck, that this would be a great time to do that. Because I know that she's been a long and committed partner of the Fort Peck tribe. So, Elizabeth, if you want to go ahead.
Okay. My work with them started back in about 2010 on a different project that was about building research capacity and a institutional review board up at Fort Peck. And in the process of that work, we had partners who said, hey, we've got these buffalo returning to us from Yellowstone, and we are telling the state and everybody else that part of the reason we are doing that is to help the people of Fort Peck, but we don't really know if the people are being affected, and help us think about how they're being affected. And that found its way into then actually doing activities to build those connections. So
Excellent.
we've been doing that ever since.
Thanks, Elizabeth. And we'll touch on that further in the presentation, but I thought that would be helpful. And for my part, I was grateful to Elizabeth and MSU because they approached World Wildlife Fund at that time when those questions were being asked, because World Wildlife Fund has been active for a number of years in bison restoration with tribes. But I would say that Fort Peck has become one of our strongest and greatest partners since that time. So we'll move into the presentation now. The path back, Fort Peck Tribe's community buffalo restoration efforts. Oh, it's not letting me advance my slides. Let's see, why is that? Oh, there we go. So I just want to start by saying that, it's really important to understand that this work begins and ends with the Dakota and Dakota people of Fort Peck tribes. MSU and World Wildlife Fund were both invited to work with the Fort Peck tribes, and we are grateful and honored by that. And again, we will touch on this more, but much of the work that we do with Fort Peck tribes is facilitated through the Pate group, and Pate is the word for female buffalo. And the reason that the group that we work with was named the Pate group is because there were a number of women in the community who were leading efforts to reconnect the people with the buffalo, and that is seen as I guess you would say in some sense a traditional role, that the women are the healers and look after those relationships and those connections. So I just want to mention a number of people from Fort Peck, and this is not an exhaustive list. And actually, I should mention that Suzanne Turnbull is on the call, and she's with Fort Peck Community College, and we welcome you, Suzanne, and thank you for being here. I don't know, I didn't have a chance to look at the entire list. I believe that might be the only person at this time from Fort Peck, but if there is anyone else, feel free to let us know. But I want to thank Lois Red Elk, Roxanne Smith, Suzanne Turnbull, Robert McAnally, Robbie Magnan, Johnny Bear Cub Stiffarm, Viola and Larry Wood, Justin Dupree, Rich Peterson, Grant Staffney, Ramey and Daryl Growing Thunder, Pearl and April Nation, Marva Firemoon, Ken Ryan, Del First, who unfortunately passed, and the Fort Peck Tribal Executive Board, as well as Fort Peck Community College, for being such wonderful partners to us and to help facilitate all that has been accomplished. And again, I'll just emphasize that everything that's been accomplished to date is through the efforts of our partners at Fort Peck, and we've just been lucky enough to be able to bring resources and some expertise to those efforts. And then I want to acknowledge MSU staff as well, who have been part of this process. And again, this may not be exhaustive, but Beth Rink, Julia Haggerty, Mike Everetts, Elizabeth Bird, of course, Christine Lux, Michelle Grocky Dewey, Brianna Routh, and I believe I saw Paul Stoys on the call, and although he may not have directly been involved in much of what we'll be talking about, he has conducted some important research up at Fort Peck that we were able to help facilitate in terms of making connections. So with that, we'll move on. So just to give you a sense of both where Fort Peck tribes reside and who they are. They are a sovereign nation, of course, governed by an elected tribal executive board. Both the Nakota and the Dakota people reside on Fort Peck. The population of enrolled tribal members residing on the reservation is about 6,700 people. And the reservation is approximately 2.1 million acres, which is similar to the size of Yellowstone National Park. And although I won't get into complex land ownership within reservations, of course, there are a number of different types of ownership within the reservation, which do create some challenges for efforts to unify land management and outcomes. I'll ask Elizabeth to speak to some of the principles of working with Native communities to start with.
So the two columns, the first column represents work that Beth Rink was doing just as I was joining the project, where they were asking actual partners up at Fort Peck what they think is needed from researchers in order to be good partners. And everything that they learned is borne out by a larger body of research, which is represented in the right-hand column, which most of which comes from the field of education. So the first principle is that the questions that we work on derive from community articulated needs. The questions, the projects, it all stems from our partners. They're involved in all phases of research or project development. That we maintain a long-term commitment and relationships that last over time, that we're invested in that community. Dennis, if you want to move forward.
Of course, for sure.
Recognizing diversity among and within the Fort Peck tribes, which is a general principle of respect for wherever the tribes are at, respecting their values and beliefs and customs, reciprocity, giving back as much as we're given to, making sure that all the results that we've developed from research, for example, are become part of the community conversation. And then respect for spiritual insight and storytelling, oral histories, and taking a strengths-based approach, not a deficit orientation of, oh, what are all the problems that need to be addressed, but rather, where are the strengths? What can we build on? How can we make those strengths even better? So those are some of the principles with which we at MSU try to approach our Native partners in working together.
Thank you. All right, now I want to get into a little bit of retrospective, and I want to start with this image. And I recognize that, you know, this might be in some ways viewed as sort of a colonial perspective, but I think at the same time it is a representation of another time and an important one. And so this painting was painted in 1839, and I should actually mention that, you know, my friend Del First, who I mentioned had passed, he told me a story of a relative of his that the story had been passed down, and that this relative was able to actually shoot 2 buffalo with 1 arrow riding alongside of the buffalo. And so I think it's important just to recognize that there was a different time when the Native people of the plains were among some of the richest and most prosperous and healthy. And actually, there was a paper published not too long ago that talked about the stature of Native people when Europeans first came, and that they were heads taller than the Europeans. So I think it's just important to acknowledge that there was a time when bison and the prosperity of the people were one and the same. And that, of course, they both revered buffalo, but also utilized them in every part in much of their life and their spiritual practices. And of course, that changed very rapidly with westward expansion, European colonization, the coming of the railroad. Now, this image, they estimate that this represents about 40,000 buffalo hides. But I think it's important to recognize that bison were estimated to number between 30 and 60 million animals before westward expansion. And so this is just a small fraction of the buffalo that were harvested. And the hides were sent east to tanneries and fueled the Industrial Revolution, because bison leather was one of the toughest leathers available and was used for belts for machinery. Now, I think that this particular map is very illustrative of how quickly these things happened. So what this represents is that in 1880, the railroad reached Glendive, Montana. In 1881, it reached Miles City. And by 1884, the last buffalo hides were being shipped east to tanneries from this region. There were no buffalo left. The last buffalo hunt at Fort Peck Reservation, which you see in the upper right quadrant, the last buffalo hunt on Fort Peck Reservation happened in 1882. So the people went from being reliant on the buffalo and hunting the buffalo among a number of other game to having none. So just recognizing 1880, the railroad arrived. 1884, they were shipping out the last hides. It was pretty dramatic. And you can imagine not only how that would have affected the people, but how that would have affected the ecosystem as well. And here's just some data to back that up. You can see hide exports, and that as of the year 1885, you can see the red line here. That was the last year that buffalo hides were exported east. But at the same time, you can see they have implied cattle hide exports. So as you can see from the year 1870 and on, cattle were being brought into the prairies to replace the bison that were gradually being removed. Again, some more estimates of the number of animals that were being removed. So, of course, after the buffalo were removed, a lot of times strictly for the hides and maybe the tongues and carcasses left to rot in many instances, there was still bones littering the prairies. And that was sort of the next wave of activity. And of course, this didn't happen all at the same time across the entire bison's range. Bison range from Alaska, where there are wood bison, all the way to Mexico. And so this happened at various times, and I'll share a map with you shortly on that. But here you can see that homesteader bone sales brought $2.5 million into Kansas alone. That was estimated to be the remains of 31 million bison. And the bones were sold to refine sugar, to make glue, fertilizer, and fine bone china. So here you can see the gradual contraction of the range of bison, and this is reconstructed from William Temple Hornaday's map from the extermination of the American bison, which he wrote, I believe, in 1889. But what you see here is that wood bison in the northern portion of their range from Alberta north numbered approximately 550 animals in his survey of the remaining buffalo, and that there were less than 500 plains bison in his survey of plains bison, which occurred from central Alberta south to Mexico. But you can see here that the darkest purple spots are the remaining pockets of animals. And the dotted lines represent a zoom in on a particular area where William Temple Hornaday, on behalf of the Smithsonian, was trying to find some animals to taxidermy for the Smithsonian, hopefully before the bison disappeared, because they did think that it was imminent that the bison was going to disappear. And when he traveled to an area just south of Fort Peck Reservation, and here you can actually see that Fort Peck Reservation is in the top right-hand corner here. So Hornaday, I believe, saw in the neighborhood of 30 bison in that area. He collected 25 of those bison for the Smithsonian, but that was also what set him on the path of working to establish the American Bison Society to rescue the bison. And although, I think this has to be one of the darkest chapters of our American history, I think it's also important to recognize that it is one of the greatest conservation stories that we have, as there was a conscious effort to rescue the bison. And although we're still working on that, it has recovered to some extent. Oh, I'm having trouble here. Let me see. There we go. So I think it's important to recognize what the absence of bison on the plains would have meant. And I think that there's more ways that it affected things than we can probably conceive of. But I think, recognizing first that for the Aboriginal people of the plains and all those people that relied on the buffalo, this would have been a complete change. And of course, as tribes were relegated to reservations, there was starvation, and there was an absence of much of what they needed. With respect to other things that bison did on the prairie, one thing that I've realized after a hard winter up in northern Montana was just looking at the highways that the bison would have created for other animals. The access to forage that they would have created. Of course, they are one of the most powerful animals on the plains, and when they dig for forage, they do leave openings in the snow for other animals to forage as well. I think, with respect to birds, there's a number of relationships, but thinking about that, bison wool is actually one of the warmest wools, warmer than sheep's wool, and that birds use that to line their nests, that rodents and other small animals would use it as well. That would have been a wholesale change as well. Bison wallows can create entire wetlands and wetland networks. They create potholes in some places where the soils are more clay-based that also retain water, and that those pools of water can create sites for amphibians to lay their eggs, for the tadpoles to develop into adults. So I think that it's just important to recognize that it would have, in that ecosystem, it would have had a huge number of effects. In terms of the recovery of bison, from 1905 to 1935, the American Bison Society collected bison and brought them to the Bronx Zoo. And then between 1907 and 1913, they were restoring bison to Western parks and refuges. And you can see here, this represents the number of bison in conservation herds, which rose to about 21,000 animals by 1935 and has stayed somewhat plateaued since then. Tribal herds, and I think it's important to acknowledge that this tracking of tribal efforts doesn't recognize that tribes were involved in some of the early efforts, like at the Confederated Salish and Kootenai tribes, where individuals like Michel Pablo started a herd that was ultimately sold to the Canadian government. But this does track at least some portion of the tribal bison herds, which now number somewhere between 15 and 20,000 bison. And then, of course, commercial herds, which are represented by the blue line, which are now somewhere in the neighborhood of 400 to 500,000 bison. And here's a representation of an approximate distribution of bison in North America. This doesn't include all, but you can see the red line represents the historical range of bison in North America. And then all of the points represent places where bison herds are known to exist. And I think it's important to recognize as well that in this recovery, one thing that hasn't been adequately represented is large herds. So geneticists suggest that herds should consist of at least 1,000 bison to maintain their long-term genetic diversity. And 75% of the wild or conservation herds actually number less than 400 bison, and a third of them number less than 50 bison. So that is one of World Wildlife Fund's goals, is to establish herds of at least 1,000 bison to contribute to the long-term genetic health of the species. And there are, of course, a number of other conservation groups that are either working on establishing large herds, wild free-roaming herds, or as the National Park Service is and the National Wildlife Refuges are engaging in metapopulation management to exchange animals to ensure that they maximize genetic diversity as well. Now to get, I guess, to a bit more of why we're here, I just wanted to put up this map that illustrates all of the native nations that exist within the Northern Great Plains ecoregion, and that's the ecoregion within which World Wildlife Fund works, although this doesn't represent north of the border into Canada. It generally does represent the tribes that we work with. And through our bison restoration efforts, I work at Fort Peck, Fort Belknap, Pine Ridge, and Rosebud reservations. But I have colleagues that work on the restoration of black-footed ferrets, and we have a sustainable finance initiative for tribal wildlife programs that was recently dubbed the Buffalo Nation's Grassland alliance. And they are working on trying to increase the amount and stability of funding to tribal wildlife programs throughout this region. With regard to our WWF Bison Initiative goal, we are supporting tribal buffalo programs and securing a chosen path to cultural, ecological, and economic sustainability. I believe that that is the way forward for bison restoration. There's actually not a lot of places where cows aren't these days, and where communities embrace the return of buffalo. And I believe that tribes offer that opportunity and are interested and willing partners. Overall, World Wildlife Fund is trying to establish 5 conservation herds of at least 1,000 bison each in the Northern Great Plains by 2025. And didn't complete the idea there, but I think that it really comes down to that. For me, I believe that bison restoration is about sustainability and working with the communities that live in the regions where bison are restored. Slide. Okay. Elizabeth, do you want to speak to this slide?
Sure. So back in 2014, to build on that history I was describing earlier, some of our partners, led by Lois Red Elk, who's pictured here, said, okay, well, we have this question, but what are we doing about rebuilding the connections between the people of Fort Peck and their buffalo? Because at that point, what we learned back in 2013 was that there were certainly plenty of people on the reservation who didn't even realize that the tribes had buffalo. There was a large number of people, the large majority, who had never visited the ranch, hadn't been anywhere near and seen the buffalo. So what can we do about that? So we organized the Peck group in 2015. I'll add to that language. Peck also means female buffalo in both Assiniboine and Sioux. And so that was another reason that we named it that, because it's a sort of a unifying term between the two tribes. So we worked on creating a Buffalo Summit, spent the next 9 months of 2015 working towards a very large Buffalo Summit, along with a number of ancillary events, educational events, and then some research pieces that we'll talk about too. I think you can go on to the next slide.
Sure. Okay.
Well, go ahead.
No, go ahead, Elizabeth.
Okay, so back in 2014, the Northern Buffalo Treaty had been signed among a number of different tribes, including the Fort Peck Reservation. And so when we went to organize the Buffalo Summit in 2015, we made a reunion of the groups that had signed the Buffalo Treaty part of the Buffalo Summit. Dennis, you want to say more about the treaty?
Sure, yeah. I'll just bring this up here. So it's now well over 25 tribes and First Nations that have signed on to this Buffalo Treaty. And I think that it's important to recognize the word treaty to many of us relates to, I guess I would say, the American notion of treaty. And we know that many treaties have been broken. But amongst the tribes themselves, they see treaty as alliance. And so when they dubbed this the Buffalo Treaty, it was about creating an alliance around a number of different fronts for tribes who are trying to restore bison, both those who have bison and those who are aspiring to have bison. And you can see from the various articles that it is a treaty on many fronts, and a treaty of cooperation around conservation, culture, economics, health, education, research, and their life ways. And I think that it is a historic alliance, and we're seeing now some of the fruits of those treaties as Fort Peck redistributes bison across the continent. But we'll speak more about that later.
The depiction of the treaty, there was artwork and graphics that Lance Four-Star did for us for the Buffalo Summit.
That's right.
So the next slide shows the summit site where we brought more than 1,000 kids, school kids, between 4th and 12th grades out to 19 teepee stations to learn all kinds of different stories and natural history and songs and anatomy and historic uses, etc., of the buffalo. And this was the first time for most of those kids to have set foot on the buffalo ranch. Unfortunately, the buffalo were kind of making themselves scarce, so they didn't get to see a lot of them. But it was a really amazing event. And the tent in the middle was where the treaty gathering was held.
Thanks. All right. Well, I'll speak a little bit about the survey that was spearheaded by the Peck group with support from MSU and WWF. As was mentioned by Elizabeth about principles of engaging communities, we really felt that it was important that the work that was done with the Peck group and at Fort Peck on the buffalo was rooted in the values, the needs, and the aspirations of the community members. And so we initiated a survey that would be done on paper, as well as being available for iPhones, for tablets, for PCs. And those surveys were distributed to senior centers, made available at the college and a number of other places. Some individuals went door to door as well to get those surveys completed. And we felt like we got a very good response from the community. There was 369 participants, 285 of those were enrolled members of Fort Peck tribes, and we actually felt that that was really important as well, that both enrolled members and members of the community participate. It allowed us to understand a little bit of the contrast in perspectives. And it's also important to recognize that on Fort Peck, that although it's not a hard divide, there is an east side and a west side, with Nakota, I believe, we're residing predominantly on the west side, and Dakota residing predominantly on the east side. And we did get a fairly even split, 51% from the east side and 49% from the west side. And overall, 63% of the responses came from women. And as Elizabeth also mentioned, ultimately, we shared those results back with the community. There were, you can see here, this essentially was a mailer, a full-page mailer that was inserted into over 3,000 newspapers. There are 2 newspapers on the reservation, so we asked that they insert those into the newspaper, providing some background on the group and what the interest was in understanding these perspectives, and then a summary of survey results. And we also made the full survey results available at fortpeckbuffalo.com, which is a website that still exists and is a resource for any papers that have been published, any videos that have been produced, any information that the Peck group wants to share with the community. But overall, we were really encouraged and felt that this was a great start to the work together, because it did identify both some strengths and some shortcomings of the restoration of buffalo at Fort Peck. So here are just a few sample results that I'll share with you. So we did use a Likert scale on this survey, although there were also some yes and no questions and some narrative questions, which Elizabeth has also summarized. But just a few examples. We should encourage our youth to learn about buffalo and other wildlife for future jobs. 91% agreed. We should use buffalo for healthful food. 87% agreed. Tribal members have a fair opportunity to hunt buffalo at Fort Peck. Only 21% agreed, so that demonstrated a need for some work on that front. I know how to obtain buffalo meat or products from sources on the reservation. 23% responded yes. Fort Peck should establish a herd for viewing that is more accessible. 70% agreed. And we should help to restore buffalo to the grasslands of North America. 83% agreed. So overall, what I felt that the survey accomplished in part was to provide clear direction to managers and leaders in the community. But also, one thing that I heard from some of the participants once they heard back on the results was that it gave them a sense that there were others that felt the same way that they did. It provided unity and unification amongst the people towards shared goals and recognition of what those goals are. So, I was really thrilled with what this survey helped start. And I'll go ahead, Elizabeth.
I should add that Eric Riley of the Helps Lab helped us field the survey and analyze it. And actually, some of that work is ongoing toward publication.
Absolutely. Thanks for mentioning that. And I should also say that, a survey is not necessarily the end of anything. It's really just a foundation for moving forward and for discussion. So that's the way that we viewed this. Now, from that survey, another important need that was identified was a need for additional capacity to deliver on all the aspirations that were expressed in this survey. And recognizing that, World Wildlife Fund was fortunate enough that we had a donor who felt that they could support a position at Fort Peck, and Fort Peck Community College helped facilitate that through a grant. And Johnny Bear Cub Stiff Arm, who is on the left wearing the Buffalo t-shirt, was hired at that time. She's a retired lawyer and has been a huge asset to the Buffalo program for the past 4 years in shaping and developing new programs and services. But this photo represents a number of the members of the Pate group: Lois Red Elk, Rich Peterson, Robbie Magnan, who is the Buffalo program manager in the black leather vest. Of course, there's myself and Monica Turkelson, who's actually another WWF staff member, who is Oglala Lakota from Pine Ridge. Justin Dupree, who is a tribal council member. Larry Wood and Viola Wood. And Viola Wood is the director of the Head Start program for early childhood education at Fort Peck. But, through the partnerships with a variety of individuals within the Pate group, tribal entities such as Head Start and Fort Peck Community College, and then of course external partners like MSU, World Wildlife Fund, foundations that have come on board as this work has unfolded, including the Butler Foundation, the Margaret A. Cargill philanthropies, among a number of others. We're anonymous foundations as well. And I think that it's amazing to see how this work has evolved. And we'll share just a few examples of some of the things that have been undertaken by this group as it has expanded and undertaken new activities. So, Elizabeth, do you want to speak to the Head Start curriculum?
Yeah, so one of the things that the Fort Peck or the Pate group indicated was that we needed curriculum at all grade levels for the schools up there and about the buffalo, starting with Head Start. So I recruited Christine Lux in early childhood education here at MSU to help work with the Head Start program up there to develop a curriculum. And there are a number of lessons that have been developed and disseminated and that are being put to use. I should just mention Viola has recently retired from the Head Start, but she was instrumental in making this curriculum happen.
Thanks. Yeah, and it was presented at a national conference, a Head Start conference in the past year, and there was a great deal of interest at that time as well. And this is a Head Start graduation where all of the kids got a buffalo coloring book as part of their recognition of graduating. I'll speak a little bit to another area where there has been some improvement and new activities. So as I mentioned before, awareness of how to secure buffalo meat and how to secure hunts was something that was identified as a concern or a challenge. And so we've done a few things on that front with the support of Johnny Bearcup Stiff Arm and Robbie Magnan. And it's important to mention that many of these things were part of the vision of Robbie Magnan, who is the Fort Peck Fish and Game Director, and really is the visionary for the buffalo program and the one who makes it work day to day. And he had always wanted to have buffalo meat sales, but when essentially he was a one-person army, he just didn't have the capacity to do everything that he wanted to. So once we had Johnny Bearcup Stiff Arm hired, we approached the tribal council or tribal executive board to ask whether we could hold affordable meat sales in the community. And it had been over a decade since they had meat sales, buffalo meat sales. And, there was some reluctance. They said, well, we tried that 11 years ago and no one wanted it. But if you really want to try, you can. And our only sort of caveat is that you sell to both tribal members and non-tribal members. And so we secured 1,000 pounds of buffalo meat that was actually secured through the Intertribal Buffalo Council at a very affordable rate. And in turn, the meat was sold at a similar rate to tribal members. I believe it was $3.50 a pound. And they sold it from, I believe it was just from Poplar, the tribal office, the first time around. And those 1,000 pounds of meat sold out in 2 days. And we kept records of those sales, and 85% of the buyers were tribal members. So then we thought, okay, well, we want this to be a learning opportunity. So let's try and sell in some of the outlying communities. So they put a chest freezer in the back of a pickup truck, and they put a bunch of frozen meat in, and they went out to some of the outlying communities that are much smaller. And they found that generally, because there weren't that many people living there, and that a lot of the people on either the east side or the west side come into the larger centers like Wolf Point and Poplar, that it made most sense to sell out of those two sites rather than in the outlying communities. But they secured another 2,000 pounds of meat, and those sold out in about 4 days. And really, I think it only sold out it took 4 days because they were trying it in multiple communities as opposed to a central location. But, we firmly established that there was a demand and an interest in buffalo meat in the community. I didn't mention the advertisement here. Another thing that was identified in the survey was just communicating things and awareness in the community. And since there was an indication that people didn't know how to secure buffalo meat or hunts, there's been a concerted effort to do more advertising in the local papers, on local radio. We've established, of course, the Fort Peck Buffalo website, as well as a Facebook page. And all of those things have increased awareness, and we've measured some of that awareness through applications for tribal member hunts, through the amount of sales of buffalo meat to community members. And just as another example, tribal member buffalo hunts are allocated by lottery. And there had been a lot of accusations in the past of favoritism with respect to awarding tribal members buffalo hunts. And Justin Dupree, who is a relatively young council member and was formerly the Sergeant at Arms, had started using Facebook Live and Facebook to raise awareness of tribal council meetings. And at his suggestion, we ended up making the drawing for the tribal member hunts via Facebook Live. So it increases transparency, it increases awareness, and in a community like Fort Peck, these days smartphones and Facebook use are nearly ubiquitous. So you actually do reach a large number of community members through these means, and we've seen a dramatic increase in the number of tribal members that are applying for hunts. This year it was nearly 300 tribal members. In past years it had been less than 100 at times. So we are seeing an increase on that front. And with regard to bison meat distribution, both, of course, there's bison meat distribution through sales, but as a result of COVID-19, one of the mitigation strategies for those in need and those who are vulnerable and at risk with respect to the effects of COVID. There have been meat distributions, and early on there were 6 bison that were harvested for the meat distributions, and those 6 bison reached 456 reservation households and impacted an estimated 1,386 tribal citizens. Now, that was the first 6 buffalo. At last count, I believe I heard there were 15 buffalo harvested, and there are plans to harvest anywhere from 80 to 100 buffalo. I think it's also important to recognize in, a lot of conservation groups might see use of buffalo as contrary to conservation of buffalo. And I can't say that that's, that might not be a fair generalization, but I think that it is a concern. And I think it really is important to recognize the values and needs of the community and desires for buffalo. They're bringing back the buffalo, which they consider a relative, which they revere. Their use of the buffalo is not contrary to restoring the buffalo. They are doing more to restore the buffalo than I think just about any group on this front today. Do you want to speak to this, or if Mike Everett's? Yeah.
Yes. Well, we're running short on time. Sure. I'll just briefly describe one of the other things that the Pattaya group prioritized was this sense that the ranch was too far out. It was hard for people to get to, but more importantly, there was no place to go out there. There was no place to stop, to sit on a bench, to walk, because it was all fenced. And so Mike Everett's from architecture and his students joined our team. And they did a lot of conversations with folks up there, and in a collaborative way developed a proposal for a 7-mile trail with benches and picnic shelters and everything that you can use actually on the ranch. And then with art installations that feature different stories about nature and the buffalo and that are evocative of storytelling for the people. So there's been a lot of enthusiasm. We've gotten quite a few different grants to make this a reality. It's still moving fairly slowly, but I believe I saw Mike is on this call, and I'm sure he'd be happy to take questions at some point if we have time or afterwards about that project. It's very exciting.
Great. Thank you, Elizabeth. And thanks, Mike, who's pictured here on the left. Many of you may know him. In the interest of time, I'll move through this fairly quickly. But again, with respect to raising awareness, there's been more happening in terms of letting the community know what's going on the Buffalo Ranch. So here you can see in April of 2018, there was a birth announcement for the arrival of calves, and then just a few facts that teachers could share with their students or that community members could share as well. I didn't mention this before. I'll speak to it very quickly, but in terms of the economic sustainability of the program, I think that's another important thing to recognize is that the restoration of bison can be an important economic driver on the reservation, as it was a driver of the economy of Plains people in the past, perhaps in a different way. But Rural Wildlife Fund helped Fort Peck implement an online hunt license sales system for non-tribal members. They were already selling hunts to non-tribal members, but we knew that we could help increase the revenue, and it has increased that revenue by tens of thousands of dollars, and that in turn helps to increase the capacity of the program to staff and to deliver programs and services. And I think one of the most exciting things that's happened recently, and many of you may have seen this in the news, this is a map representing the recent redistribution of bison from Fort Peck to 16 different nations, tribal nations and First Nations and Alaska Native nations on the continent, as well as some past transfers to both Fort Belknap, and to Wind River Reservation, the Eastern Shoshone, as well as a transfer to the Bronx Zoo for their captive breeding population. So, I think that this is a great example of what the ongoing efforts at Fort Peck can achieve and have achieved. At one time we were talking about, can Fort Peck host quarantine of Yellowstone bison? And now we're looking at the fruits of their labor. They are the sole recipients of Yellowstone bison directly from Yellowstone National Park, and they are now helping to seed new herds and to supplement native nation herds across the continent. And it's just really exciting and wonderful to see, and I'm so happy for our friends and partners at Fort Peck. So I think at this point, I'll just say, that together, it's my hope that we're developing a model of cultural, ecological, and economic sustainability for tribal bison restoration. And that is being led by the community, and we're bringing to it what we can. And Elizabeth just reminded me, and I think this is really important. I've heard this many times from our tribal friends and partners, that the fate of the people follows the fate of the buffalo. And so, I think that in all these ways of reconnecting, what we're hoping is that it contributes to the health and the well-being of the community, of the people, and contributes to cultural restoration and identity. And this is Daryl Growing Thunder and Ramey Growing Thunder. Ramey is the director of the Language and Culture Department, and this was from the Buffalo Summit, and they were teaching the children about all the uses of buffalo. And I just really hope that many of these children have now seen buffalo on their reservation. Johnny Bearcup Stiff Arm talked about that, at one time that was just something that they knew existed at a zoo or something like that, but buffalo are part of their lives again. And I hope that, each subsequent generation can say more about their connection to buffalo. Anything else to add, Elizabeth, or anyone?
No, we should see if there's a couple questions. I think
Yes.
Madison is going to field those through the chat function.
Yeah, so I haven't had any questions come through the chat yet, but I'll repeat again for folks, if you do, please type those in. We can get those to Dennis and Elizabeth to answer.
And feel free to connect with us via email. I'm happy to talk. As you're all aware, after 50 minutes of me blabbing, I can talk. So.
Perfect. Well, give it a couple of minutes for folks. I know it takes a moment to type in, but thank you both so much for a wonderful presentation. So we've got a question from Sasha that just came in, and he says, what is the relationship between the Fort Peck and Fort Belknap reservations and the APR in terms of conservation efforts?
I can speak to that somewhat, but there has been some exchange of animals. In the past, American Prairie Reserve has moved some animals to both Fort Peck and Fort Belknap, and I believe that there may be some animals that will move back from Fort Peck and Fort Belknap just to increase the genetic diversity of the herd at the American Prairie Reserve. I don't know if that exchange has happened yet. I think Daniel Kinka is actually on, and he could maybe put that in the chat if he cares to. He's with American Prairie Reserve, but he could speak to that better.
Awesome, thank you. We have a question from Christopher Preston here that says, are there any legal or political obstacles to bison transfer from Fort Peck to other reservations or to non-reservation lands?
Absolutely. We're actually seeing an example of that right now. One of the transfers from Fort Peck was to Standing Rock Reservation, which straddles North Dakota and South Dakota. And I believe that stock growers in North Dakota are trying to exert some influence over that transfer because the bison stem from Yellowstone. And even though they have been through extensive testing, years of testing, and the state vet of Montana has certified them brucellosis free, before they even went to Fort Peck, there is still concern and opposition, and in some cases that can create obstacles to moving bison.
Awesome. We have a follow-up from Daniel. He said yes, Fort Belknap and Fort Peck bison will be coming to APR soon. And he said we've also sent APR bison to both those reservations and others. So just a follow-up to that first question.
Great, thank you.
And then a comment as well from James Pritchard that says, "Wow, I'm struck by the bison distribution map. It looks like the distribution of wildlife from Yellowstone National Park back in the 1920s. They went everywhere."
That's great to hear. Thank you.
Awesome. Do we have any other questions folks want to send through the chat? Still got a little bit of time before 1 p.m.
Suzanne Turnbull is on, I believe, if she was able to stay on. Is there any chance that you could unmute her? And I don't know whether there are other community members, but I'd love for Suzanne just to chime in if she doesn't mind.
Yes, I just unmuted her, so let's see if her audio works.
Hi, Suzanne, are you there? And if she isn't able to answer, that's fine. I just thought that I would ask.
Not hearing anything.
Okay, that's all right. I'm just glad she joined us.
Thank you. Well, I don't see any other questions coming through at this moment, but as Dennis and Elizabeth said, I put both their emails are in the beginning of the chat thread as well if you want to reach out to either of them after this presentation if something comes up, or just to get in contact with them and talk more and learn more. Yeah, and do y'all have any final parting thoughts or anything before we sign off?
Yeah, I'll just say that this project has been such an important and major enrichment of my life in terms of all of the relationships and friendships that I have with folks up at Fort Peck, as well as the partnerships that have been built here at MSU. It's just such a rewarding project.
And I'll echo that and just say that, this time of COVID-19, I feel like one of the biggest sacrifices I've made is not being able to travel to Fort Peck, because I consider everyone up there friends and miss seeing them and working with them. And as I think, many of you will know, relationships really are the foundation of good work. And it's been a pleasure to develop those friendships and relationships at Fort Peck.
Awesome. Well, we have one final question did come through, so that'll be our last one, and it's from James again. He said, could you just talk about the fear of ranchers about bison and brucellosis, and just maybe explain that a little bit more, and then that'll be our last question, then we can sign
Sure.
off.
Yeah, I there's lots of resources out there, but I would say that the challenge is that brucellosis can cause abortion in cattle. It was originally introduced to bison by cattle, but then brucellosis was generally eradicated in the cattle herds in North America. But Yellowstone remains a reservoir for brucellosis, but that's why the quarantine process is so important for bringing some of the important genetics of Yellowstone bison to other sites and other herds to create satellite herds of Yellowstone genetics. And they were among the last wild herds when bison were eradicated. So they have a lot of meaning in that respect too. But I think that to some degree, there is some greater fear of competition for grazing resources that kind of underlie some of the stated concerns about brucellosis. And I'm not minimizing the concern about brucellosis, but some people are concerned that bison could supplant cattle. But I think it's important to recognize that there are now tens of millions, if not over 100 million cattle in North America, and there are 500,000 bison. So I don't think that we're at risk of supplanting cattle. But I think that it is a perceived threat. And in some cases, some areas have a strong knowledge and culture of bison operations. South Dakota has many bison ranches, but there are areas in Montana with relatively few bison ranches. So it's maybe fear of the unknown in some respects as well.
Awesome. Thank you for answering that. Well, thank you again, both Dennis and Elizabeth, for a wonderful presentation. And thank you so much to everyone who joined us today for this seminar. And I hope everyone has a wonderful rest of your Wednesday. So thank you all.
Thank you. Really appreciate it.
Yeah.
I'll just draw attention to Suzanne Turnbull's comment in the chat. She can be our closing comment there.
Love it. Thank you, Elizabeth. Awesome. Thank you all.
Okay.